He fixed engines quietly for 20 years, never bothered anyone, never told war stories. But when 6 armed bikers kicked down his garage door demanding money, they discovered the old mechanic's hands weren't just good with wrenches, they were trained to kill. Welcome to Story with Horsey, where ordinary people reveal extraordinary pasts. Before we dive into this incredible story of a quiet hero's moment of truth, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These tales of hidden courage need to be told. Eddie Martinez had been fixing cars in Millbrook for exactly 23 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Not that anyone was counting, but Eddie remembered everything. Dates, faces, the sound every engine made when it was dying. His garage sat on the edge of town, wedged between a failing diner and an empty lot where weeds grew through cracked concrete. Most folks knew him as the guy who could fix anything with an engine and wouldn't overcharge you for it. He wore the same blue coveralls every day, sleeves rolled up past weathered forearms that told stories he never shared. His hands were steady, calloused, and precise, whether he was threading a bolt or reaching for his morning coffee. The garage itself wasn't much to look at. 2 service bays, a cluttered office with a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, and walls covered in calendars from auto parts stores. But Eddie kept it clean, kept it honest, and kept to himself. He opened at 7 every morning, closed at 6 every evening, and in between those hours he spoke only when spoken to. Engines shot, he'd say, or be ready Tuesday, or 9650. No small talk, no gossip, no complaints about the weather or the government or kids these days. People respected his quiet. Some called him antisocial, others figured he was just focused on his work. A few of the older folks in town remembered when he'd first arrived, summer of 2001, driving a beat-up pickup truck with California plates and not much else. He'd rented the garage space from old Walt Henley, paid 6 months up front in cash, and never missed a payment since. The only unusual thing about Eddie was how he moved. For a man in his 60s who spent his days hunched over engine blocks, he was remarkably fluid. No stiffness when he stood up, no favoring one leg over the other. And his eyes, they never stopped moving. Not nervous, just aware. Like he was always scanning, always ready. But in a town where the biggest excitement was usually a high school football game or a barn fire, nobody paid much attention to an old mechanic's habits. That changed on a Tuesday in October. The Reapers Motorcycle Club had been making their presence known across 3 counties. 8 men, all wearing matching leather vests, all riding Harleys that sounded like thunder when they rolled through quiet streets. They weren't local. Nobody knew where they'd come from or where they were headed, but their reputation followed them like exhaust smoke. Gas stations got robbed, convenience stores lost their cash registers, small businesses suddenly found themselves paying protection fees they'd never needed before. The local sheriff, Tom Bradley, was a good man, but his department consisted of himself, 2 deputies, and a dispatcher who worked part-time. Against 8 armed bikers who didn't seem to care about consequences, he was outgunned and outmanned. By the time they reached Millbrook, word had spread. Store owners started closing early. People avoided downtown after sunset. The town held its breath and waited for them to move on. They didn't. Tuesday afternoon, around 4:30, the rumble of 8 motorcycles shattered the usual quiet of Main Street. They rode in formation, slow and deliberate, like a parade nobody wanted to watch. Dogs started barking, curtains twitched in windows, children were called inside. Eddie heard them coming from 3 blocks away. He was under the hood of a '98 Chevy pickup, replacing a timing belt, when the sound of the engines reached him. He paused, listening. 8 bikes, all Harley-Davidson, probably Sportsters and a couple of touring models. One of them needed new rings. He could hear the slight knock in the idle. He didn't look up when they passed his garage the first time. didn't look up when they circled back 5 minutes later, engines revving louder. But when they pulled into his parking lot and cut their engines, Eddie slowly straightened up and reached for the rag hanging from his back pocket. 6 of them dismounted. 2 stayed with the bikes. The one who seemed to be in charge was tall, broad-shouldered, with arms covered in tattoos and a beard that hadn't seen a razor in months. He wore dark sunglasses despite the cloudy afternoon and walked with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no. "Afternoon," he called out as they approached the open bay door. His voice carried the kind of casual menace that made smart people nervous. Eddie looked up from the engine, nodded once, and went back to work. "I said afternoon," the man repeated, stepping closer. "Heard you," Eddie replied without looking up. "Garage closes at 6. You need something fixed, bring it back tomorrow." The biker laughed, not because anything was funny, but because he wasn't used to being dismissed. His companions spread out slightly, forming a loose semicircle around the work bay. "See, here's the thing, old man," the leader continued. "We're not here to get anything fixed. We're here to talk business." Eddie set down his wrench and finally looked at them. His expression was calm, almost bored. "Don't have any business to talk about." "Sure you do." The man stepped closer, close enough that Eddie could smell the cigarettes and cheap whiskey on his breath. "See, we've been talking to other business owners in town, explaining how dangerous it can be, running a shop all by yourself. Lots of things can happen. Accidents, break-ins, fires. Real shame when a man loses everything he's worked for." Eddie's eyes moved slowly from face to face, taking inventory. 6 men, all younger than him, all bigger than him. 2 carried pistols in shoulder holsters under their leather vests. 1 had a knife clipped to his belt. The others probably had weapons he couldn't see. "Thing is," the leader continued, "for a small monthly fee, we can make sure nothing bad happens to your business. Call it insurance." "Already have insurance," Eddie said. "Not this kind." The man's smile was all teeth and no warmth. "This is the kind that keeps you breathing." Eddie wiped his hands on the rag, taking his time. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost conversational. "How much?" "Now you're talking cents. $500 a month. Cash. First payment due right now." "Don't have $500. The leader's smile faded. "Then we have a problem." "No," Eddie said quietly. "You have a problem." That's when everything changed. The man reached for his gun, a snub-nosed .38 in a leather holster. He was fast, probably faster than most people he'd ever threatened. But Eddie was faster. The wrench in Eddie's right hand moved in a perfect arc, connecting with the man's wrist just as his fingers touched the grip. The sharp crack of breaking bone was followed immediately by a scream of pain. The gun clattered to the concrete floor. Before the leader could process what had happened, Eddie's left hand grabbed the front of his vest and yanked him forward, off balance. His right elbow came up hard, connecting with the man's solar plexus, driving all the air from his lungs in a single gasping wheeze. The whole sequence took less than 2 seconds. The other 5 men reacted like dominoes falling. 2 reached for their guns, 1 grabbed for his knife, and the other 2 charged forward with their fists raised. Eddie moved like water. He spun left, using the gasping leader as a shield against the first gunman. His boot caught the second gunman in the knee, not hard enough to break it, but hard enough to drop him. The knife wielder came in fast and overconfident, slashing horizontally at chest level. Eddie leaned back 6 inches, letting the blade whistle past his nose, then stepped forward and drove his palm up into the man's chin. The crack was audible. The 2 who'd charged in with fists found themselves grabbing air as Eddie sidestepped and swept one man's legs out from under him. As he fell, Eddie's knee came up to meet his ribs. The man hit the ground hard and stayed there. The last one standing swung wild, a haymaker that would have taken Eddie's head off if it had connected. Instead, Eddie ducked under it, pivoted, and delivered a short, sharp punch to the man's kidney. He dropped like a stone. 6 men down in less than 10 seconds. Eddie stood in the middle of the carnage, breathing normally, holding the .38 he'd picked up from the floor. The two bikers who'd stayed with the motorcycles were reaching for their own weapons when Eddie's voice cut through the air. Wouldn't. His tone was conversational, almost friendly, but the pistol in his hand was rock steady, pointed directly at the closer man's chest. Your friends here are still breathing. You want to keep it that way. You'll put your hands where I can see them. They did. Eddie walked slowly toward them, never taking his eyes off their hands, never letting the gun waver. When he reached the first man, he relieved him of a .45 automatic and a butterfly knife. The second man carried a sawed-off shotgun and another pistol. Now, Eddie said, stepping back to where he could see all 8 men, we're going to have that conversation about business. The leader was sitting up now, cradling his broken wrist, his face pale with pain and something else, fear. He'd recognized something in the old mechanic's movements, in the way he'd disarmed 6 armed men without breaking a sweat. "Who are you?" he gasped. Eddie considered the question for a moment. "I'm the guy who fixes engines," he said finally, "but before that, I was the guy who fixed problems the Navy couldn't solve officially." He let that sink in for a moment. 26 years, Navy SEALs, Team 6 for the last 8, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and a bunch of places that don't exist on any map you've ever seen. Retired in 2001, came here looking for quiet. The leader's face went white. Even in his pain, he understood what he was hearing. Navy SEAL Team 6 wasn't just elite, they were the elite of the elite. The men who went places other special forces couldn't go, did things other operators couldn't do. "Found my quiet, too," Eddie continued. "Fixed a lot of engines, helped a lot of people, never hurt anybody who didn't have it coming. But now you boys have come into my town, threatening my neighbors, trying to shake down people who work hard for what little they have." He walked slowly around the group, keeping the gun trained on them, his voice never rising above conversational level. "See, that's a problem for me. Not because I'm looking for trouble, I'm not, but because I took an oath a long time ago to protect people who can't protect themselves, and that oath doesn't have an expiration date." One of the men on the ground, the one who had had the knife, tried to sit up. Eddie's foot pressed down on his chest, not hard, but firm enough to keep him in place. "Now here's what's going to happen," Eddie said. "You're going to get on those bikes and ride out of this county. You're not coming back. You're not going to bother anyone in this town or any other town within 100 miles of here. You're going to find yourself a new line of work, something that doesn't involve threatening innocent people." "And if we don't?" the leader managed to ask. Eddie smiled for the first time since they'd arrived. It wasn't a pleasant smile. "Well, like I said, I used to fix problems for the Navy. Permanent solutions to complicated situations. I'm retired now, but some skills don't fade, you understand?" The leader nodded slowly. "Good." Eddie stepped back, still holding the gun. "Now, there's a hospital about 30 miles south of here. I'd recommend you stop by and get that wrist looked at. After that, I'd recommend you keep riding." It took them 5 minutes to collect themselves, mount their bikes, and disappear down the road. Eddie watched until the sound of their engines faded completely, then walked back into his garage and returned to work on the Chevy's timing belt. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Bradley arrived with both his deputies and found Eddie exactly where he'd been when the bikers showed up, under the hood of the pickup truck, wrench in hand. "Eddie," the sheriff called out, "we got reports of some kind of disturbance down here. Everything all right?" Eddie looked up, nodded once. "Everything's fine, Tom. Just had some customers who changed their minds about needing service." The sheriff looked around the garage, noting the scuff marks on the concrete, a few drops of blood, and the fact that 8 motorcycles were nowhere to be seen. "They say where they were headed?" "South," Eddie replied. "Don't think they'll be back." Sheriff Bradley had known Eddie for over 20 years. He'd never asked about the man's past, never pressed for details about where he'd come from or what he'd done before arriving in Millbrook. But he wasn't stupid. and he'd seen enough to know that some questions were better left unasked. "Well," he said finally, "I appreciate you looking out for the community, Eddie. Always have." Eddie nodded and went back to work. And the next morning, word had spread through town about what had happened at the garage. Details were scarce. Eddie wasn't talking, and the sheriff was keeping things quiet. But people knew the bikers were gone and they weren't coming back. The diner owner stopped by with a free lunch. The bank president came by to shake Eddie's hand. Half a dozen other business owners found reasons to drive past the garage just to wave or nod their thanks. Eddie accepted their gratitude with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. No speeches, no explanations, no requests for recognition. Just a nod and a return to work. That evening, after closing the garage, Eddie sat on the old milk crate he used as a chair outside the service bay. He sipped black coffee from a thermos and watched the sunset over the quiet town he'd called home for more than 2 decades. A young boy rode his bicycle past the garage, slowed down, and called out, "Hey, Mr. Martinez, my dad says you're a hero." Eddie looked at the boy for a long moment, then said, "Your dad tell you what makes someone a hero?" The boy shook his head. "Being there when people need you," Eddie said. "That's all." The boy rode away, and Eddie finished his coffee as darkness settled over Millbrook. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A truck shifted gears on the highway. The town breathed quietly around him, safe and sound. Tomorrow there would be more engines to fix, more quiet work to do. And Eddie Martinez, the mechanic who had once been something else entirely, would be there to do it. Because some oaths never expire, some skills never fade, and some heroes never stop being ready.